out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest, they ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face, they're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdan Province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key, the fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep, no dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest, a caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
We find our adventurers today grappling with newfound abilities at the cost of a dear friend. Dwarf Lundgren, dwarven cleric, had returned to the light. Thomas had found a new pact, a celestial patron under the promise to protect Dwarf's friend Zora. Zora, meanwhile, found himself grappling with an entirely different kind of force. He felt a wild surge within him, a raw, untamed magic, unlike anything he'd wielded before. It was unpredictable and chaotic, and yet oddly comforting. The wisdom granted by the elder seemed clearer now, as though some veil had been lifted from his eyes, leaving a profound sense of purpose and clarity. He had stepped outside the cottage to the modest dock, alone and pensive. After a few hours, the rest of the adventurers went to find him, asking if he was all right. Zora appeared deep in existential thought, staring off into the glittering lake that stretched before them. The reality, of course, was slightly less philosophical. Zora was not fishing for truths or existential balance. No, he was quite literally fishing. True to form, Zora processed his trauma in the only manner he truly trusted, with food. He was a half-elf of simple comforts and insatiable appetite after all. As the hours passed, he meticulously emptied the lake of its bounty, pulling fish after fish from the shimmering depths. Soon enough, the campfire crackled merrily beneath a mountain of cooked trout, smoked bass, and grilled salmon. By the time Zora had reached his culinary limits, he leaned back, patted his belly, the act itself almost philosophical. His eyes glazed in contemplation, or perhaps merely in the aftermath of digestion. Trauma, he reflected, could wait another day. Right now, there was simply no more room for it. He had caught and prepared enough provisions for the long road east. They left the relative safety of their newfound bastion, and the adventurers stepped once more into the shifting winds of the province. Tannertown awaited. The lakeside calm was a memory now. Its gentle breeze and still waters traded for the clatter of hooves and the rustle of caravans along the eastern road, where traders, tinkers and travellers from across the Verdan Province passed in steady columns, their carts creaking under the weight of goods and gossip alike. But the true spectacle was unfolding behind the party, where a boy no older than 10 clung to Zirath's presence, like a bard to a bawdy story, perched atop a shaggy pony that clopped with ponderous loyalty. For a brief blessed moment the boy had been silent. Then came the deluge. He asked if Zirath laid eggs, if he breathed fire after spicy food, why his eyes were gold, what happened when he sneezed, if he molted like a lizard, whether he could fly when no one was looking, if his armour was magic, what dragon sweat smelled like, and, most critically, whether he could melt cheese just by holding it. Zirath offered no reply. No expression, no acknowledgement. His gaze stayed forward, posture noble, as if he were meditating on the celestial order of things and had left his body to do the riding for him. The others were not so composed. Thomas had stuffed part of his cloak in his mouth to stifle laughter. Friz had removed her glasses twice to wipe away tears of amusement as she whispered a growing tally count under her breath. And Zora was actively taking bets with himself on when Zirath would crack. But crack he did not. At least not in the usual sense. The boy, possessed by some unholy cocktail of enthusiasm and childhood invincibility, was undeterred, and it became clear to all that he genuinely believed that if he just kept talking, Zirath would eventually adopt him as a squire, sidekick, or dragonkin in training. Somewhere between question 73 and a wild theory involving dragon farts and thunder spells, Zirath brought his horse to a stop. With a long, slow breath, he turned, locked eyes with the boy, and exhaled a single elegant plume of fire just above the boy's head, controlled, precise, and so close it warmed his eyebrows. The silence was immediate. The boy's jaw fell open. He blinked. Then, with a look halfway between terror and delight, wordlessly, he turned his pony around and began riding the other direction, backward, never taking his eyes off Zirath, who resumed riding as if nothing had happened. Thomas collapsed into laughter. Friz muttered something about weaponized stoicism. And Zora, licking fish grease from his fingers, declared that fire really did solve everything. Celia couldn't help but think Zirath had actually somehow played with the boy in his own strange way. But much like his plate armour, Zirath was not an easy man to crack. As they continued eastward, the trees thinned and rocky trails gave way to rolling golden plains, their grasses rippling like water beneath the wind. In the far distance, jagged blue-grey mountains rose, and to the north, a fresh road carved through the edge of the darkwood, a reminder of old contracts, monstrous wolves, and the absence of Thalia, whose shadow lingered in all their thoughts. Tannertown stayed on the horizon for days and miles onward, a testament to the expansive grass plains. They passed newly tilled farmland on the outskirts, bulls dragging ploughs and children planting seeds behind, bamboo windmills creaking over grain and sawmills. But what drew pause weren't the machines, it was the people. Elderly men and women with sun-darkened skin moved slowly through the fields, their gnarled hands still steady at the plough. Children no taller than Thomas's belt worked alongside them, carrying buckets, lifting sacks, stacking dried sheaves with practiced quiet efficiency. There were no overseers with whips, no barking foremen or armed guards, no chains or shouted orders. And yet, the air hummed with something unspoken, something uncomfortable that none could name. The city had no gates. It didn't need them. From miles away, anyone could be seen coming. Its homes were modest at the edge, but stone turned to cobble, then to grandeur, the deeper they went. Travellers' tents ringed the city, bright banners fluttering over carts and fire pits roasting full beasts. Music wafted gently through the camp, loud and joyous, while thin, sun-worn workers moved with steady, silent focus. No guards, no rest, just endless, precise labour. Zirath scanned everything, movement, posture, exits, while Celia's eyes lingered on a girl cleaning blood from a butcher's table beside laughing visitors. The contrast spoke volumes. Thomas, meanwhile, watched the people, always the people. His instincts, trained by years of con artistry, pickpocketing, and navigating the subtle shifts of mood that foretold danger, told him something was off. There was joy here, yes, and the energy of celebration pulsed through the air, but underneath it all was something too still, too quiet in the eyes of those doing the hardest work. These were not villagers enjoying prosperity. These were people making a place ready, for what none of them yet knew. Zora, nearly weeping with joy, reached toward a skewer longer than his arm with reverence. He beamed as he tore into a chunk of the well-seasoned treat. It was clear something was happening in the east. The bank, the expedited travel permits, and the influx of travellers. It was all pointing to something happening. The spider weaved its web, and the threads pointed east. True to their nature, our adventurers could not ignore the prospect of gold and glory at the upcoming Quicksteel Tourney. As the sun burned above the plains, Thomas found his thoughts drifting from the scent of meat and music toward the shaded boughs of Darkwood's Vale, and pulled from his pack the moss collected from the felled Giaramundo's guardian tree. That rare, pliable moss, taken in just the right amount, was capable of being worked into armour like nothing the guilds could forge, flexible as cloth, resistant to blade and puncture, and even capable of slowly reforming, a living weave of natural magic stitched into leather. Once in the city proper, after a few misdirections, some unsolicited sausage samples, and one surly blacksmith later, they found themselves at Ilarian's luxury linens and leathers. The name suggested curtains and formal wear, but the inside was a dizzying theatre of silk bolts, shimmering leather vests, incredible light armour, and gnomish tailors who darted between fittings. At the centre of the whirlwind, a tuft of white hair emerged behind the counter before rising, via podium, into the full presence of Ilarian himself, or as he insisted with a wink, Leather Larry. Thomas presented the moss and Larry responded with sudden, serious wonder, summoning an apprentice so quickly a mannequin barely survived. Gone were the theatrics, and in a reverent tone he proclaimed the moss legendary. Durable, elegant, and brimming with arcane threads. He eyed them in honest awe, asking where they had gathered such a rare and wondrous thing. He snapped back into his lively business persona. It would take a month, he warned, gesturing with both hands as if conjuring the time from the air. But when finished, the armour would bear the Leather Larry look, which was apparently an actual trademark design philosophy involving combat-ready elegance and battlefield couture. Thomas, sensing both the quality and the cost, some 500 gold pieces, politely declined for the moment. He promised to return after the tournament, perhaps once his friends won it outright, and that sentiment sparked something in Larry's eyes. The gnome lit up like a candle, leaning forward with conspiratorial delight, whispering that the best in the province were arriving for the tournament. Even Thaddeus Flint himself was set to participate. The adventurers looked at each other, clearly signalling that the name meant nothing to them. So Larry, after casting a theatrical glance around the shop to confirm no rogue ears were loitering near his finely stacked shelves, launched into an explanation, delivered with the kind of hushed intensity typically reserved for haunted mansions and cursed heirlooms. Thaddeus Flint, he implied, wasn't merely a rancher. He was the rancher, an untouchable figure, whose name carried a certain gravity in every corner of the city. The guilds acknowledged it, the guard gave it a wide berth, and even the city's less reputable elements seemed to make a point of not sharing the same sidewalk when he was in the area. It wasn't fear, or so Larry insisted. It was respect. Though the kind of respect that came with crossed streets, lowered voices, and the occasional dry swallow. It had been Flint's idea, apparently, to push for the region's self-reliance, the new roads, the grain mills, the irrigation, the orderly work camps with no lashes and plenty of food. Stand proud against the turning province was what Flint had declared, according to Larry. And the East, isolated and often forgotten, had rallied under that banner, strong, proud, and perhaps just a little too orderly. There was something behind Larry's eyes then, a flicker of unease. He didn't speak it aloud, and they didn't ask. Some discomforts, like fine embroidery, were best not pulled at too hard. They thanked him for his time, and as they turned to go, Zirath asked where in the city they might find the best daggers. Larry's brow rose, and with a gleam of steel-worthy drama, he announced that the finest blades in the province weren't made in Tinborough, exceptionally, but at Dagger Dax's hardware across town. The name hit Zora and the rest of the group like a thrown brick. Dagger Dax, the slippery rogue they had crossed paths with in the depths of the Darkwood, was from Tanner Town. A would-be traitor, a trap-setter, a name Zora had not heard since the snapping of wolf jaws and the scent of blood on pine. His fists clenched and his stomach growled. The group couldn't help but think that this town was getting very interesting. Following Leather Larry's directions, the party made their way across the city, weaving through streets that bustled with an energy that felt, to some, a touch too rehearsed. Market stalls were open and orderly, every display neatly stacked, every transaction civil and quiet. Children scrubbed windows while elderly folks swept stoops with the same unwavering rhythm of ritual, their eyes on their work, never wandering. There were no guards in sight, not a single blade badge or bribe-taker posted at any corner. But the calm was maintained nonetheless, like a performance nobody dared disrupt. To Thomas it felt curated, to Zora it felt strange. And yet, despite the order, the city breathed. It lived. And its breath carried them to a squat, slate-stone storefront wedged between a spice merchant and a modest tea hall. Over the door, written in clean utilitarian lettering, was Dagger Dax's hardware. Zora's hand lingered near his blade before he even stepped inside, his muscles drawn taut with an energy that wasn't quite anger, but shared some of its features. The memory of the trap in the dark woods still clung to him like dried blood. Dax, if she was here, would have some explaining to do, and possibly some bruises to collect. Zirath, true to form, was only interested in knives. Friz, Thomas and Celia exchanged a single silent glance of shared dread and quiet hope that no one would bleed in a store, quite literally filled with knives. Inside the shop was a shrine to edged elegance. The walls were lined with display cases and glass-fronted drawers, each one housing daggers of every shape, style and origin. Curved crises, weighted throwing knives, hunting blades with ivory hilts, each meticulously labelled and lovingly arranged. It was the kind of shop that demanded reverence, and even Zora hesitated a moment at the threshold. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with tired shoulders and an apron that had seen its share of steel. His smile was courteous, practiced. Zora wasted no time. He stepped forward and, with barely contained intensity, asked to speak with the owner. The attendant's expression shifted. The polite mask cracked just slightly, replaced by something more vulnerable, something that looked almost like grief. He explained gently that Miss Flint hadn't been seen in some time. She had taken a contract out in Tinborough, chasing after one of the higher-paying guild bounties, and simply never returned. No letters, no word, no sign. The attendant admitted it softly, but the slight tremble behind his words landed like a blow. The old man seemed to have cared for Dax. The adventurers shifted where they stood. The young rogue had seemed entirely self-interested, which was not unusual for adventurers. Dagger Dax was also Thaddeus Flint's daughter. The attendant seemed proud of the young rogue as he told them, plainly, that she hadn't run the shop out of entitlement, but ambition. She'd wanted to earn her way, to bring in the coin needed to keep the business alive. She had meant, as the old man said, to make it herself. The party stood quiet. No one brought up the wolves or the ambush, or how Zora had at length discussed that he might have crushed her skull like a melon. Some in the party suspected there was still a twinge of heartbreak mixed with the anger, but they would never say it aloud. There were details better left in the forest for everyone involved. Zirath, cutting through the silence like the paladin he was, mentioned the tournament and their intent to win it. It was blades they now needed. That changed the air. The attendant brightened visibly, launching into motion as he displayed the finest wares in the shop. Simple but serviceable daggers for close work, balanced throwing knives that gleamed with silver edges and pride of place. A set of hand-forged daggers so precise, so razor-sharp, he claimed they could cut the wing from a butterfly mid-flight and leave it still flying. They were beautiful, they were also staggeringly expensive. The haggling began, Zirath cool and unflinching, the old man growing more animated with each counter-offer. The paladin made a final proposal. If he won the tournament, he would publicly credit Dagger Dax's hardware for his blades, giving them a surge of prestige and business. All he asked in return was to pay only half the cost of the finest set. The old man took the offer in a heartbeat, perhaps a little too quickly. There was a smile in it, but something behind his eyes betrayed the truth. He didn't truly believe they would win, not against the province's best, not against Thaddeus Flint's own deadly hands. Zora said nothing as they left, but whatever had burned behind his eyes earlier now seemed quieter, no less intense, just tempered. In any case, he had blades to sharpen to keep his mind occupied. He and Zirath left with a fine set of blades and the satisfaction of a good bargain. They shook on the deal, and the old man looked Zirath in the eyes, unwavering. They had brought the will to compete, and now they had the steel to win it. The city still bustled with life, its streets flowing with travellers and traders, as if some invisible clockwork drove them ever onward. Booths of bright cloth pitched along the roads, sold spices, sweets, and everything in between, while smiths shouted over the ring of their own anvils and bards played cheerful tunes near fountain courtyards. It was Friz who first noticed the woman, old, bent nearly in half, her spine curled like a shepherd's crook. She swept the stone-paved street with a broom twice her size. Her mouth moved constantly, lips cracked, muttering curses with a rhythm that suggested they had been said often and with conviction. They approached her carefully, perhaps too directly, asking whether she was being made to clean, whether someone had forced her to this labour under the sweltering sun. The woman didn't even flinch. She spat, a dry and practised gesture, and muttered bitterly about the Skinner and his tax. Her words spilled out in fragments, how she'd spent a lifetime mending saddles with hands that had once been proud and precise, only to find herself in retirement, pressed back into work under the burden of paying the Skinner's pound of flesh. Her curses were wide and unfocused, her broken back, the cursed heat, the broom, her aching hands, and even the very air that refused to cool. She never looked up, never paused her sweeping, as if the broom had grown into her hands and there was no point fighting it anymore. Naturally, they asked the question that hung thick in the air. Who was the Skinner? The old woman didn't hesitate. She didn't whisper. She didn't glance around in caution. She spoke the name loud and clear, as though daring someone, anyone, to stop her. Thaddeus Flint. And with that she spat again, cursed the broom anew, and went right back to sweeping. No guards came, no neighbours shushed her, no one said a word. That silence was louder than any shouted warning. The group exchanged glances. Something shifted. Beneath the order and brightness, beneath the shimmering streets and jubilant storefronts, there was a weight pressing down on this city. It didn't show itself in chains or violence. It hung in the sun like a second heat. It bent backs. It soured breath. It swept streets without question. They walked on after that, their steps quieter, conversation falling away as each mulled over the layers beneath the surface. Even Zora's appetite seemed dulled, his usual nose-led wanderings forgotten as they moved through the city like ghosts with names on their lips. When they reached the town square, the mood was no less still. A crowd had gathered in loose clusters, murmuring and pointing toward the tourney grounds at the square's far end. The grounds were still being built. Wooden scaffolding and fresh-cut beams stretched upward as workers hammered under the watchful eyes of foremen. But it wasn't the construction that had drawn the crowd. A raised platform had been set in the centre of the square, and standing atop it was a small assembly of finely dressed figures. The crowd leaned in, whispers rising. The party paused at the edge, eyes narrowing. They had found the tournament stage, but it seemed they were not the only ones watching. The crowd parted slowly near the square's edge as the adventurers approached, the scent of sawdust and fresh varnish still thick in the air from the half-built bleachers and scaffolds that framed the tourney grounds. At the centre stood a raised platform on which a tall, pinched man stepped forward, clutching a sheet of crisp parchment in one hand and a peculiar amplification stone in the other. His voice, though cold and distant, boomed unnaturally across the square as he read with all the warmth of a winter ledger. Harken Bank, he declared, was proud to sponsor the first Quicksteel Tournament in over 3 generations, a momentous event meant to restore glory and spirit to the eastern provinces. The bank, in its boundless generosity, had doubled the purse to encourage commerce, good cheer, and the general uplifting of hearts in what he delicately called a darkening province. His voice droned on in perfect monotone, reciting phrases that might have inspired applause had they not been drained of all sincerity. Words like unity, prosperity, and solidarity fell from his lips like expired leaves. The crowd, perhaps recognizing the script for what it was, responded with only the faintest applause, polite but unimpressed. An old man stood beside the delegation, hunched in a well-fitted tunic with a silver pin in the shape of a coiled blade fastened at the collar. When the banker finished, the old man took the stage and offered a round of thanks to the chief comptroller of Harken Bank and his fine delegates from Central City, who returned the gesture with solemn, coordinated nods. Among the party, expressions tightened as the name settled into the air like a familiar ghost. Harken Bank. It was not the first time they'd heard it, but it was the first time they'd seen its agents in the flesh. Sharp suits, sharper eyes, a presence built on paperwork and silent ledgers. They leaned in, listening now with far more care than the townsfolk around them. The old man continued with greater warmth than his banking counterparts, introducing himself as the great-grandnephew of the last winner of the Quicksteel Tourney, and honoured to serve as this year's chief arbiter. The grounds, he said proudly, would soon be able to seat 10,000 spectators when completed, a number that drew murmurs of awe from the crowd. And this year's tournament would feature new safeguards, designed to prevent those last-minute poisonings and cases of suddenly dropping dead that had marred previous contests. That line earned more than a few sidelong glances. There would be no gambling, he added, none whatsoever. Not in the stands, not behind the tents, not even whispered behind spice stalls. And most notably, all participants would be required to swear a blood oath witnessed and bound by the Phantom. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the mention of the name. Even Frizz, who normally treated legends like puzzles to be solved, blinked. Zirath crossed his arms. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Zora scratched his neck and muttered something about not liking the idea of bleeding before the bleeding starts. The old man unfurled a scroll from his pocket, one that rolled and unrolled and then kept unrolling until it spilled down past his knees. It was, he explained, the code of the bladeslinger: rules, stipulations, conditions, and conduct. Every clause had been carefully reviewed by law magistrates dispatched from Harken Bank's legal office. The document, it seemed, anticipated and accounted for every possible permutation of trickery, skullduggery, and last-minute shenanigan one might be tempted to try. The following is a dramatic rereading of the old man's rules, where no one contestant could hinder the ability to participate directly or through the following.
Unlike the last cheating, poisoning, and premature murder-filled Quicksteel Tourney of my great-grandpappy's brother, this special edition will have magical measures to ensure that any killing, maiming, or emotional damage is done on the tourney grounds during tourney times by willing tourney participants. As such, no one may interfere with blood-bound participants, including but not limited to friends, family, hired men, hired women, hired mercenaries, hired jesters. Don't laugh, it's happened before. Bodyguards, courtiers, paid patrons, spouses, estranged or otherwise, lovers both secret or acknowledged, long-lost twins, vengeful exes, bribed clerics, bribed judges, bribed bartenders for slipping poison in a drink, bartenders who weren't bribed but got hit with a suggestion spell, alchemists, poisoners, psychics, petty criminals looking to cause random mischief, thieves, assassins, bards singing distracting songs mid-throw, bards playing a single ominous note to shake a man's nerves, bards who think they aren't doing anything wrong but just happen to be playing. Any goddamn bard at all. Conjured illusions, minor illusions, major illusions, grand illusions, and yes, any variant thereof. Ghost sounds, disembodied voices that sound like a contestant's dead grandpappy, whispering "Don't miss, boy," fiends, devils, demons, lesser imps, greater imps, anything crawling out of the hells, abyss or shadow plane, looking to make a deal, kept spirits, unkept spirits. Don't be letting some haunt whisper boo in a man's ear.
necromancers, ghostly apparitions, sentient weapons that just so happen to give advice mid-throw, any sword that hums, chants, sings, or otherwise provides an unfair advantage. Automatons, clockwork constructs, golems, golem lawyers, arguing about golem rights, dragons, obviously, any tiny dragonkin that technically ain't
A full dragon, but sure acts like one.
familiar birds carrying messages mid-throw, rats whispering tactical advice, spectral hands moving a knife just a little off mark, mage hands, disembodied hands, cursed hands, possessed hands, hands that are detached but somehow still involved, invisible servants, visible servants, semi-visible servants, changing the winds with magic, changing the ground with magic, changing your luck with magic, changing another man's luck with magic. Sorcerers saying, "What? I didn't do nothing." Wizards muttering in the background, even if it's just good luck, hexes, curses. Hexes disguised as good luck charms that are secretly hexes. So-called God's blessed tokens that might just happen to alter fate. Any so-called benevolent deity sticking their divine nose where it doesn't belong. Divine intervention in any form looking at you, clerics. Patrons from beyond the veil giving inspiration at the last second. And absolutely anything that comes from the Fae, the Hells, the Shadow Plane, or your cousin Bert's backyard, where weird stuff always happens.
The rules, the chief arbiter said, would be reread aloud in full 2 days before the tourney, when participants would officially declare and swear their oath to the Phantom. The rules list just kept unfurling, flap after flap, as the old man held it like a sacred relic. Somewhere down the list, a section titled Prohibited Alchemical Supplements and How to Identify the Smell of Them fluttered in the breeze. The crowd was still watching, some curious, some uneasy, and the adventurers, now fully aware of just how serious this tournament had become, exchanged quiet glances. No bets, no tricks, and a blood oath backed by a myth. Zora frowned, Thomas smirked, and Zirith, ever steady, simply nodded once. This tournament was no backwater brawl. It was something much, much larger. As the arbiter concluded his speech, offering final thanks and rolling up his mountainous scroll, the delegation from Harken Bank descended the platform in perfect, pointed silence. Their polished boots clacked across the boards as they slipped into the crowd with all the urgency of people who disliked being near common air for too long. Thomas watched them go and leaned toward the others, suggesting it would be less suspicious if he followed alone. They agreed with quick nods, and he vanished into the crowd, his cloak already catching the rhythm of passer-by. Zirath turned soon after, murmuring that he'd explore the city on his own. It was just a little too clean for his liking. The lay of Tanner Town would speak more clearly in quiet corners than on a stage. With his axe resting like judgment across his back, he strode off without ceremony. Frizz, bright-eyed and curious, mentioned the local arcana shops. She had never been to Tanner Town, and the magics related to the local industry intrigued her. Zora and Celia followed without debate, drawn by habit, protection, and maybe the scent of grilled food along the way. And just like that, they scattered. They would reconvene at dusk at the Velvet Fang. Until then, the city was theirs. Frizz, Zora, and Celia peeled away from the bustle of the tourney grounds, drawn back into the heartbeat of the city by curiosity more than purpose. The mood remained light between them, with the last rays of afternoon stretching across the rooftops. Frizz flagged down a passing local and inquired, with that scholarly crispness of hers, where the finest arcane supplier might be found in Tanner Town. She was pointed well past the town square to a place called the Arcane Outfitter, and with that, the three of them set off once more, weaving through streets that were, curiously, missing all the usual friction points of a provincial city. No shouting guild reps hawking for membership, no beggars reaching for coin, no closed shutters or broken carts in alleys. It wasn't tidy in the artificial sense. It was functioning, and oddly so. Celia remarked, more to herself than anyone, that no one looked overworked, but no one looked free either. Eventually they found the shop, the Arcane Outfitter, a crooked little building tucked between a dry goods stall and a wind chime vendor. Inside, The air was thick with lavender and scroll dust, and the walls were absolutely brimming with enchanted trinkets, charms carved in the shape of local animals, potions in dried gourd flasks, and spell scrolls labelled with useful but humble spells, like mending, speak with animals, and detect water. The whole shop looked less like a wizard's lab and more like a wizard's barn, a place of field work, not fireworks. The gnomish wizard behind the counter was no less charming. He stood barely 3 feet tall, his robes patched with sun-faded thread, a delicate fennec fox perched on his shoulder like a second familiar. The moment Frizz stepped through the door, his face lit up as if he'd just been told the rains had come early. He greeted her with reverence, speaking of the honour of having a professor from Mistras, his voice trembling with delight. He hadn't seen one, he said, in nearly 40 years. Frizz froze for half a breath, her brow twitching with confusion, until she remembered the little brass owl ring, the last boon the headmaster had given her. Behind her, Celia and Zora each delivered a subtle but unmistakable elbow to her ribs. She straightened her posture. Of course she was a professor. Technically accurate if one squinted hard enough and ignored context. The wizard was overjoyed to serve her and offered a discount for the honour. She purchased a few scrolls, commissioned the transcription of a more complex one, and in the midst of conversation, casually asked about the phantom. The mood in the room changed. The little gnome grew hushed, not fearful but reverent, as he described the figure. Not a myth, he insisted, but a presence. A fey guardian of the plains, neither spirit nor beast. Half shepherd, half wolf. He protected the balance of the land, watching the herds, the grass, the wind. He culled what grew too wild and hunted what grew too greedy. Few claimed to have seen him with certainty, though stories circulated, of hoofbeats with no riders, of thunder that rolled across empty skies, of a presence that moved unseen among the tall grass. It was, the gnome admitted, mostly conjecture. But no one laughed when they spoke his name. The plains were ancient, dangerous, some things belonged to them, not to men. When the scroll was completed, the wizard returned it with great care, and a final beaming reminder that it had been a true joy to serve a professor from Mistras. Frizz managed a tight smile, unwilling to mar the illusion with bitter truth. She couldn't bring herself to speak of the Academy's current state, the hollow halls, the secret research. Instead, she nodded and forced a smile. As they stepped back onto the street, the sky had already begun to deepen into indigo. Lamps were being lit, casting long shadows through the market. The day had grown thin. It was time to find the Velvet Fang. We take a pause from our story for a word from our sponsor.
Folks, times are tough. Food prices are soaring, the spice fields are half frozen, and if you want a good meal, you might have to trade a kidney and your grandma's heirloom dagger. But you know what's still going strong at rock-bottom prices? Grosnack's homebrews. That's right, while the world scrambles for overpriced goods, Grosnack's is keeping his prices so low, even Ettins won't argue over the deal. You want a healing potion? Grosnack's will do probably. Need a little extra oomph in your step? He's got something for that too. Are you not entirely sure what this glowing green bottle does? Look, neither is Grosnack. But it's 2 silver, so why not find out? Now, I know what you're thinking. What if my potion does something unexpected? Well, let me tell you, most of Grosnack's potions are completely intentional. So don't waste your coin on those overpriced, regulated alchemist guild slop with their tested and safe formulas. Take a chance on Grosnack's. Yes, Grosnack's homebrews. Pop the stopper and gobble the goo!
Grosnack's, cheapest in the land. Pop the stopper and gobble the goo.
We return to our tale with Thomas following the Harken bankers, now leaving from the tourney stage. The bankers moved with measured purpose through the streets, their polished boots tracing a practiced route past high-end clothiers and textile houses. They didn't speak to locals nor to each other, and when they entered a shop, it was with the confidence of people whose coin outweighed conversation. Always courteous, never warm, they moved like ink flowing across a ledger, slow, precise, inevitable. Thomas tailed them expertly, slipping between awnings and archways, weaving through foot traffic with the grace of someone who'd played this game before. Occasionally, he'd stroll casually into a shop ahead of them, pretending to browse bolts of dyed wool or admire embroidery, only to drift back into the street once they passed. He was rusty without his magic. No misty step to vanish if things turned. But his instincts remained sharp, and he didn't need arcane tricks to keep eyes on his quarry. He noticed, with a practiced thief's glance, that the bankers had accumulated a small armoury of expensive purchases. Silk bundles, lacquered boxes, fine threaded coats, enough, he guessed, to outfit a gala or grease a dozen wheels. Whatever they were doing here, they weren't exactly pinching coppers. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across Tannertown's narrow streets. Thomas paused as the road widened ahead, opening onto one of the city's main thoroughfares. A deliberate, purpose-built passage flanked by narrow side alleys where herds of sheep and small cattle were being led by young drovers. The animals moved in rhythm with the town itself, herded efficiently along paths that avoided the main commerce lanes. Tannertown, it seemed, had been built with one purpose in mind: to move meat, harvest hides, and send the rest packing. A city, quite literally, paved in blood and built on the backs of the bleating. And rising from the heart of it all, like a crowned monarch on a throne of industry, was the Velvet Fang. The building dominated the avenue, a sprawling colossus of stone and timber stitched together from multiple connected halls and towers, each facade boasting a different flavour of wealth. Carved posts and gold-trimmed windows wrapped around its perimeter, with elaborate balconies and smoking decks overlooking the square. Red and gold banners rippled in the wind, and the warm, inviting glow of stained-glass lanterns beckoned travellers from every corner of the province. It was a castle masquerading as a saloon, a spa dressed as a cathedral. Several floors stretched upward, one clearly a ballroom, another alive with the rhythmic hum of a gambling hall, while somewhere near the rear, steam curled skyward from heated bathhouses and mineral pools. The scent of perfume and roast meat wafted from vents and chimneys, mingling with the distant clang of piano keys and drunken laughter. It was extravagant, theatrical, and had just enough wild frontier grit to feel dangerous in the most luxurious way. Thomas leaned against a post, watching as the bankers, still silent, still immaculate, approached the Velvet Fang's gilded entrance. That was handy. He could wait for his friends here and enjoy a drink. This, he figured, was where the real game would be played. He followed them in, and what he saw was very disconcerting. He'd need to warn the others the moment they came in. Elsewhere in the city, Zirith moved through Tannertown like a blade through silk, slow, deliberate, and just sharp enough to draw glances. His presence alone drew attention at first. Dragonborn didn't exactly blend, but he'd long since grown accustomed to that. The armour, the height, the silent confidence, it all tended to discourage more than it invited. When he asked for directions, people answered quickly. He wasn't looking for temples or trading houses, not inns or arenas. He was after the warehouse quarter, the edge of town where the crates outnumbered beds and the shanties clung to the walls of industry. That was where the truth of a city could be found, not in stages or speeches, but in the backs that bent to lift it all. His path took him across town, past the windmills and workshops, to where the city breathed harder and the air thickened with salt and iron. Slaughterhouses lined the blocks in grim procession, their tiled roofs stained by years of steam and soot. The smell of blood clung faintly to the stones, but it was masked with something stronger: order. Carts moved with purpose, hauling barrels of salt water, draining sluices through narrow trenches carved to keep the filth flowing away from the main roads. Zirath had seen places like this before, but never so clean. The shacks had doors that fit their frames. The gutters ran clear. There was no garbage piled up, no loiterers hunched in alleyways, no rusting knives or broken bottles wedged in between the slats, and strangest of all, no guards. Not one. He narrowed his eyes. If there was rot here, it had been taught to wear gloves and button its coat. One narrow street lay quiet as the sun began to fade. Zirath stood at its edge and spotted a man, not moving, not slouched or idle, standing tall, eyes forward, shoulders straight. A sentry, though not in uniform. That was interesting. Zirath slipped behind a short stack of crates, keeping just enough of a line to watch. Time passed and the sky deepened, nearing the red and orange of sunfall. Then another figure appeared, walking with the casual grace of someone who had every right to be there. A lean man in a yellow shirt and a black vest, middle-aged, calm, unreadable. He leaned in, whispered something to the sentry and waited. The sentry responded not with words but with action. He turned, reached behind him, and pounded 3 times on a stack of barrels and crates. There was a click, barely audible, and part of the wall opened. A hidden door built of a stack of salt boxes, hinged, well-oiled, and obviously often used. Zirath exhaled slowly through his nose at this small victory. There it was playing out before him, a whisper of a password, a message through a crack, a secret place beneath the city's polished surface. He didn't have the key yet, but he would find it. He marked the alley in his mind, the crates, the angles, the scent of the air, then turned and made his way back toward the Velvet Fang, boots quiet against the stone. Whatever Tannertown was hiding, it was hiding well. But now he knew where to look. The adventurers reunited beneath the high arches and flickering chandeliers of the Velvet Fang's grand lobby, their footsteps echoing off marble inlays and burnished wood floors. The interior was a sprawling monument to decadent design. Multiple buildings connected by high-vaulted hallways, wrought-iron staircases coiled between floors like metal vines, and glass-ceilinged walkways gave glimpses into bathing chambers, card halls, and salons filled with music and firelight. Thomas was already there, leaned casually against a velvet-draped column with a drink in hand. They began exchanging their tales of roaming as they stepped deeper into the opulence. Thomas recalled what he had seen inside the hotel. The bankers, still stone-faced and immaculate, had walked through its grand archway like it belonged to them. As soon as the men had stepped inside, the concierge, a young half-elf with perfectly combed hair and the aura of someone one bad tip away from a nervous breakdown, had nearly tripped over his own boots in his haste to greet them. It was clear the bankers meant money for the hotel, evidenced by the attendants swarming them. What had concerned Thomas was where the bankers had gone. He explained that 2 towering automatons guarded a grand spiralling staircase going straight to the top floor. Thomas nodded toward them, and the group looked. Instantly they knew what had unnerved Thomas. Gleaming with brass and silver plating, their limbs hummed softly with arcane pulses. Their eyes glowed a soft green, and their movements were too smooth for the common automatons found in most highbrow establishments. Though not quite the same in appearance or sophistication, the constructs before them bore the unmistakable influence of Karzak the Accursed's designs. The very designs that had on multiple occasions nearly meant their demise. Thomas continued his recounting. The bankers had presented a crystal pendant, like a key of sorts. The moment it came within range of the automatons, both constructs emitted a faint harmonic chime, and the green glow in their cores intensified as though something internal clicked. The automatons had then nodded politely and loudly welcomed the bankers to the Velvet Suite, using some sort of artificial projected voice. Frizz mentioned a built-in magic mouth spell, which was interesting. Thomas nodded. In all his years sneaking into vaults, castles, and gala halls with locks most locksmiths would weep over, he had never seen anything like those crystal key-controlled constructs. If they wanted to sneak up into the upper floors and check out their rooms, a heist would likely be in order. No one missed Thomas's reflexive interest at the prospect of dabbling in his old habits. They made a note to investigate the constructs as soon as they could. As they approached the main desk, a sharply dressed concierge greeted them, with the kind of cheery precision, though he was unable to hide his assessment of them, roughshod from the road. They asked about accommodations, expecting the usual simple room. But this wasn't like other travellers' inns. The concierge rolled out various tiers of luxury the Velvet Fang could offer. He started with the highest private floors, known as the Velvet Suites, the pinnacle of luxury and exclusivity, offering private spas, dining salons and suites with silk-threaded bedding and self-warming floors. For the meagre sum of 3,000 gold per night, guests could access not only these personal comforts, but the full amenities: the spa complex, the grand dinner hall, and tonight, most notably, the ballroom. Tonight, the concierge proudly added, the Velvet Fang was hosting none other than the Lady of Inkwell herself, who would be entertaining the crowds with her wonderful spectacle of dancing and juggling. He was equally enthused, stating that a famed bard, Amadeus von Halen, would accompany her. The party made a quiet note to visit the ballroom later in the evening. As if sensing their lingering interest in the finer things, the concierge added one final, tantalizing detail. The hotel had hired the finest cook in all of Central City, master chef of the Gilded Dragon, to design the entirety of the festivities' meals. Everyone, he said, from the highest perch to the most modest cot, was to enjoy blends of meats and spices designed by the master chef himself. The party interrupted the flow of the concierge with a sharp question about the automatons guarding the Velvet Suites. Again, the concierge beamed, delighted to unveil another jewel of the Fang's crown. Those, he said, were the newest arcane constructs from the forges of Tinborough, crafted with elegant steel, bound by high-thread enchantments, and animated by proprietary arcana. They were a joint venture between many guilds and firms. They served as bellhops, guides, and, he added with disconcerting cheer, instantaneous executioners for any would-be thief foolish enough to sneak into the upper floors, designed to detect, track, and eliminate intruders in seconds. Their vaunted capabilities did not make any of them feel better about their stay. They exchanged gold for modest bedroll rooms in the basement. They went down to drop off their gear and packs and made for dinner. Zora mused that conspiracies involving powerful banks, strange constructs, and spiders moving in the shadows most likely required a full stomach. As they laid out their things, our adventurers planned their next actions. They would need to get closer to the bankers before the tourney. That was sure enough. The vision of the silver and gold chain was beginning to become clearer. The bank's hold on the province. The spider lurking in the darkness was another matter. It might have been the professor, or Karzak somehow having survived. In either case, the appearance of the new automatons hinted at some sort of resurgence. The professor and Karzak had been for a time odd allies despite the motives for their allegiance never having been truly clear. First, they would head for a delicious dinner to find out more about the master chef. Then they'd attend the festivities at the ballroom to see the famed Lady of Inkwell at work. The group made their way through the winding halls of the Velvet Fang. The halls heading toward the main dinner hall was already humming with life, full of travellers, merchants, and minor nobles, all dressed in their finery, heading to some sort of unique dining experience at the frontier of the province. As the adventurers walked through the sprawling complex, discussing next steps and theories, a display caught the eye of Frizz and Zora. A decorative shrine to the special guest master chef the concierge had spoken of hung on the wall. Warm lanterns lit fresh banners trimmed with golden embroidery, each one displaying the stylized flame emblem of the Gilded Dragon, the finest restaurant in the province. A series of oil paintings had also been hung depicting scenes from inside the Gilded Dragon. In the largest one, the master chef stood proudly in his uniform, flanked by dignitaries and well-fed elites. A wide grin plastered across his face like a seal of approval. It was Frizz who first said it aloud, her brow furrowed in that way that usually meant she was connecting several dangerous thoughts at once. They had seen this restaurant before. The illusions they had seen back in the professor's laboratory months ago. Phantom images projected with no source, flickering images cast through space like mirages. They hadn't made sense then. A bank, a greenhouse, and a beautiful dinner hall. Now, however, yet another thread of the spider's web had shown itself. The restaurant they had seen in the grand illusion was the Gilded Dragon, and it so happened its head chef was a guest of Tannertown. The bank had a sigil and name the adventurers had heard one too many times before, that of Harken. And now they too were here as well. The last piece of the vision was still out there somewhere. But this confirmed what they had only suspected. The illusions hadn't been random, and they hadn't been accidents. The professor was up to something. The threads from the spider's web were showing. And Central City, that shining seat of coin, culture, and quiet danger, was now firmly stamped on their path in the near future. Their ruminations were interrupted by a booming voice familiar to Thomas and Zora, who cried out to "Hold it right there!" Oh, sudden stomp and a familiar voice raised with indignation shattered the group's quiet contemplation like a goblet dropped at a royal feast. He was coming toward them with purpose, barreling, really, bellowing about the nerve it took for them to show their faces around here. The group froze mid-turn, hands twitching slightly toward hilts, components, and exit strategies. For a breathless moment, it seemed like the dinner hall was about to become the duel hall. Then he got close enough to the party for them to see his beaming grin. The man marching toward them was broad-shouldered, silver-stubbled, and unmistakably the retired rancher from the card game in Bridgerton, the one who had watched their madcap escape from an underground poker game turn mad dash free-for-all. He was someone who knew them, worse, he recognized them. And then he slapped Zora on the arm with a laugh so loud it rattled the nearby cutlery. The old rancher spoke to them like long friends, stating he hadn't laughed that hard in years, calling their exit a work of art. He had retold the story so many times he'd started charging people to hear it. Zora blinked, halfway caught between a defensive crouch and a confused smile, as the rancher doubled over, wiping tears from his eyes. The tension dissolved like sugar in wine. Thomas stepped in as a man already halfway to spinning a tale. He declared that sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do, especially when the alternative is losing his head. He meant it both metaphorically and extremely literally. The rancher nodded solemnly. He, too, understood the delicate politics of keeping one's head attached to one's neck. The conversation shifted easily. The rancher asked what brought them to Tannertown, and they explained. Zirath with measured words, Frizz with mild restraint, Zora already salivating at the mention of victory feasts, that they intended to enter the Quicksteel Tourney. That gave the old rancher pause. And then he grinned again, broader this time, and extended an open invitation to join him for dinner. They accepted without hesitation. The dinner hall's murmur faded into the background as the group settled around a thick carved table beneath a chandelier shaped like an antlered stag. The old rancher, still chuckling from their reunion, waved off the house staff and insisted they sit, drink and listen, because he had a tale or two worth the telling. He wasn't here for the casino games, he explained. He had no interest in fleecing wide-eyed traders or bored nobles trying their luck. No, he was here for the real game, the one that didn't take place under chandeliers and velvet. The word among the card aficionados was out that Lucky himself was coming in from Cedar Crest, and where Lucky went, some real card-playing would follow. That name got no reactions from the group. The former cattle baron went on. Lucky, as the rancher told it, was no ordinary gambler. He played illegal games with high rollers, whales like himself, and made the Cedar Crest underground a lot of money. But cards were just part of the myth. He was also a woodcarver by trade and, more interestingly, the finest dagger duelist of the woodlands. He was reportedly entering the tourney. Zirath took note, quietly connecting dots. The hidden door in the warehouse district, the strange absence of disorder in a place that should have been chaos. Perhaps that was where Lucky played. If so, it might also be where answers waited, daggers and all. The rancher, still chewing on his slow-roasted mutton, said Lucky's real name was Luke. But with win streaks like his, plus the habit of throwing cards and knives with surgical accuracy, people started calling him Lucky, and he'd never bothered to correct them. Eventually, the conversation turned far more serious. They asked what he knew about Thaddeus Flint. The rancher paused mid-sip and nearly choked on his drink, coughing into his napkin before fixing them with a look that hung between amusement and warning. He leaned back, sighed, and gave them the story straight. The East, he said slowly, used to be a wilder place. There was no true provincial guard to speak of, and no laws worth mentioning. Ranchers and shepherds battled over land, cattle, and water rights. Among the barons vying for power, fields were burned and herds were slaughtered. Tannertown wasn't the sort of place to walk about at night. Or in the daytime, for that matter. Flint, back then, had nothing more than a patch of scrubland and a few dozen head of cattle. Then someone decided he wasn't worth the trouble of negotiation. One night, Flint and his daughter had gone riding to watch the red moon, a moment of peace and quiet between father and child. Meanwhile, competing cattle barons had burned his home to the ground, while his wife had been inside. Thaddeus Flint, the rancher said, swore revenge. He left his young daughter with a friend and disappeared into the plains for 4 years, returning a completely different man. He returned and unleashed a storm of vengeance. One by one, the guilds bowed. The ranchers followed, he continued, or they vanished in blood and mud. And the rest of those that might stand up to him quickly learned to follow. The bloody East burned and bled into a sort of controlled order. The rancher sipped his drink more slowly this time and said he'd been the last to hold out again Flint. Thaddeus came himself. No army or hexes, yet he had nonetheless made it past his guards and patrols. Thaddeus Flint spoke quietly and thoughtfully with a knife at his throat and an offer too sharp to decline. He'd sold, and as a matter of fact, Flint now lived in the manse that had once been his. The aging rancher said he was fine with it. After all, he said, he'd gotten a good price instead of putting up a fight. Flint had ushered in order, even if it came with blood. Those first years were violent. More steel in the dirt than he'd ever seen, but since then there'd been peace. An uneasy one, sure, but peace nonetheless. The old man raised his glass, smiled without bitterness, and said he now travelled the province, spending his gold, while his blood still ran warm. He'd made his peace with the price of order. Dinner was as exquisite as the concierge had promised. Braised duck with honey-glazed roots, crusted flatbreads, with sauces poured like artwork. To our adventurers it was a meal as different from road rations as dragons are to geckos. Thomas reached for his coin pouch with all the grace of a man who knew it was for show, but before he could so much as gesture toward the server, the rancher waved him off with a grin. He said the meal was on him for the laughs and the big ones, pointing toward Zora, working hands, which was fortunate. Thomas had never actually planned to pay, nor did he have the gold to pay it. The rancher, full from his meal and flush with stories, mentioned he'd likely be heading toward a certain hard-to-find card game. Without so much as asking, the cattle baron offered up what he figured they'd need eventually. He told them the password was brisket. Zirath nodded, remembering the street and fake crate facade. The old rancher had an eye for people, they all admitted to themselves, and they said they were heading to the ballroom to see the evening's entertainment, though not before old rancher gave party a once-over and raising a brow. They weren't exactly dressed for velvet and chandeliers. He gestured meaningfully toward their travel-worn gear, suggesting they might need a touch of Tannertown refinement if they intended to turn heads and not stomachs. Zora sniffed his jerkin, still stained faintly with the scent of fish, smoke, and possibly regret, and agreed without argument. The rancher shook Thomas and Zora's hands in turn, thanking them again for their previous escapades and the legendary laughter that had followed. Then, with a grin and no clear direction, he slipped away into the crowd, promising nothing and all but guaranteeing they'd see him again soon. With the sun bowing low behind the city walls, the group wasted no time and made a hasty return to Ilarian's luxury linens and leathers. Leather Larry greeted them like long-lost nobility, absolutely delighted at the thought of dressing repeat customers for a night of music, mystery, and courtly mischief. With gleaming scissors and gnomish flourish, he outfitted them in record time. Rich forest greens paired elegantly with Frizz's vibrant red hair, and a shimmering ensemble of gold and bronze tailored for Zirath that turned him into the very image of a noble-scaled guardian. Zora, to everyone's amusement, was deemed passably gentlemanly once Larry was through, and Thomas, in new finery, mostly looked like Thomas usually did. One boot polish back to passing into wealthy crowds. He then stated that Celia was the absolute image of lean muscle and elegance in what Larry called the Bamboo Hill's finest spider silk. They paid handsomely, as expected, and rejoined the tide of finely dressed guests pouring into the Velvet Fang's grand ballroom, where candlelight and crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden glow. Inside, the crowd pulsed like a single creature. Nobles, merchants, guild leaders, and adventurers all packed shoulder to shoulder. On stage, a lone figure commanded the room. Amadeus von Halen, the bard the rancher had named, sat centre stage with a lute forged more like a weapon than an instrument. His fingers moved faster than the eye could follow, the music crashing in haunting, gravel-tinged waves of magically amplified sound. He struck a final piercing note that seemed to hang in the rafters, and the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Amadeus von Halen bowed, moved aside, and she stepped forward. Clad in flowing violet robes and leather tailored to war and wonder, the Lady of Inkwell took the stage. Blades gleamed at her hip, on her belt, and in a dazzling bandolier across her chest. Her hair shimmered in silver and streaks of coloured dye, and her eyes held the kind of playful menace usually reserved for storms and sorcerers. Amadeus announced her with flair, calling her the finest blade juggler in the land, and while one half of the room cheered with explosive energy, the other half remained silent, stiff with loyalty to their own local legends. The divide was subtle, but the party noticed. She began her performance with poise, thanking Harken Bank for their generous sponsorship, words that landed somewhere between sincerity and satire, then invited a few of the bankers on stage, who complied with visible reluctance. Amadeus resumed playing, his strumming slow at first, then accelerating like a rising heartbeat, matching the lady's steps as she spun and dipped with increasingly sharp grace. The blades began to fly, first 2, then 4, then more, until the air shimmered with steel. The bankers stood in a line, exchanging nervous glances as the music quickened, the tempo building like a thunderclap waiting to fall. And then, as the crescendo reached its peak, she struck. In a blur of motion so swift it might have been teleportation, 6 blades flew in a series of pinpoint strikes. With 6 solid thuds, they landed 1 inch to the left of each banker's foot. Not a cut, not a nick, but close enough to ruin a perfectly polished boot and an entire week's worth of confidence. The crowd gasped. The hilts sparkled. Zora, Zirath, and the others exchanged impressed glances. She was every bit as good as they'd heard, possibly better. The applause swelled through the ballroom like a tide, cheers rising from the dazzled crowd as the Lady of Inkwell took her bow, poised and graceful as ever. The bankers, visibly relieved and doing their best to smile through clenched jaws, shuffled off stage with the stiffness of men who'd survived a close encounter with performance art and mortality. She motioned them off with a flick of her hand, elegant, dismissive, queenly, and the crowd began to settle. But then, with no warning, she moved, and it was fast, too fast, and even Amadeus, usually the picture of composure, faltered on a chord. A final dagger flashed through the air, not toward a target, but into one's path. It buried itself in a wooden post, no more than a hair's width, from the throat of the last banker exiting the stage. The blade didn't graze him. It didn't need to. The precision alone left the man frozen, his eyes wide, and his colour gone. She smiled sweetly, bowed again with theatrical elegance, and the crowd, delighted and clueless, roared with delight. The banker, white as salt, didn't move until she sauntered over, plucked the blade from the post like it was part of the choreography, and planted a kiss on his cheek with the same hand that had nearly slit his throat. The audience saw grace and daring. Zora and Zirath saw something else entirely. They hadn't blinked during the throw, not watching the blade, but her face. And what passed across it in that single heartbeat wasn't showmanship. It was fury, rage, sharpened and thrown with the kind of precision that came from more than practice. The motion had been too sharp, too raw, the shift in her posture too subtle for a performance. That wasn't flair. That was a message. The two warriors exchanged a glance and said nothing at first. Later, back among the group, they shared what they'd seen: the clenched jaw, the flash of hatred, the icy calm that followed. Whatever part the Lady of Inkwell played in the performance, it wasn't just entertainment. A conversation with her, it seemed, was rapidly becoming a priority. The final blade still quivered in the wood when the Lady of Inkwell bowed once more, all elegance and showmanship, her violet coat flaring like a banner in the wind. The bankers, though trying desperately to mask it, looked as though they'd just survived a duel with death wearing a smile. As they exited the stage, one foot still shaky, the crowd erupted again in thunderous applause, swept up in the spectacle. And then, before anyone could catch their breath, she leapt from the stage. With a magically amplified voice, she called for dancers, challengers even, any bold enough to match her step for step, on the floor. The crowd stirred, uncertain. Friz and Celia exchanged a glance, shrugged, and stepped forward. Zora followed, grinning wide. Even Zirith joined, folding his arms first in quiet protest, then relenting with the air of someone ready to prove a point. Thomas, meanwhile, claimed a tragic injury, caused either by a jilted lover or an angry sand golem, depending on which version of the lie you preferred, and took to spectating instead. He leaned over to Zora and Zirath. He would try for one of the crystal keys with some quick-handed manoeuvres of his own. They both nodded, and off he went to the still shaken bankers. Back at the gathering crowd, the lady was explaining her next act. The rules were simple. The lady would lead with a move, and the line of dancers would mirror it. The music would rise, the steps would grow harder, and those who faltered would bow out. The crowd gathered around the open space, clapping to the beat as Amadeus von Halen began strumming with playful menace, shifting between sharp rhythmic chords and bouncing harmonies. The lady moved with liquid precision, her movements a blend of dance and martial form. Fast, fluid, and never quite predictable. One by one dancers dropped. Laughter, applause, and cheers followed each fumble, but it wasn't mockery, it was revelry. Zora, after a valiant series of stomps and lunges, bowed out to fanfare. Friz held on longer, fueled more by grit than grace, but eventually staggered out of rhythm and threw up her hands in mock surrender. Only Celia remained. The monk's training showed in every pivot and step, her body honed for motion, her focus unshakable. The Lady of Inkwell grinned, spinning faster, her pace increasing with every movement. Celia kept up, leap for leap, turn for turn. The dance became a duel. Gasps echoed as Celia performed a sweeping spin, a rising kick, and a flawless return to balance, palms to floor, legs in the air. An improvised kata turned graceful display. The music hit a final chord and the lady stopped. She didn't falter, she didn't feign loss. She bowed. With no theatrics, no flourish, just a nod of genuine respect. The crowd roared in approval, the applause deafening as Celia righted herself and nodded back. The two warriors united for a breath in mutual admiration. For the rest of the evening, the revelry turned to the bawdier ballads of Amadeus von Halen, whose fingers worked the lute with reckless abandon while tankards and laughter filled the ballroom. The Lady of Inkwell smiled graciously, accepted the passing congratulations and playful pats on the shoulder, and made her way to a quiet table tucked into the corner, her back to the wall, eyes on the crowd, her blade still visible and within reach. Eventually her admirers drifted away, the tide of attention turning elsewhere. And when the time was right, the party moved to follow. Not with weapons drawn or questions shouted, but with the quiet intent of those who had seen too much not to ask, and who knew a conversation worth having when they saw one. As the dancing competition was happening, Thomas had that familiar itch, the kind that crept in when velvet ropes, restricted staircases, and places marked private loomed overhead, and the velvet suites were no exception. One of those crystal keys would get him in, and once he was there he could improvise. After all, Improvisation had always been one of his finer qualities, especially when a well-timed eldritch blast could open doors just as easily as a lockpick. The bankers were still gathered near the corner table, their grandeur dulled by drink and the aftershock of blade-based theatre. The one who had nearly become a stage prop stood out immediately, his skin still pale, his hand shaking slightly as he poured another glass of high-priced wine with the desperation of a man who believed it might put his soul back together. Thomas watched him for a moment, cataloguing the man's posture, his state, and the way his coat sagged slightly over one side, just enough to suggest something tucked within. That was his mark. With a loose-limbed stumble and a bottle held like a life-preserver, Thomas crossed the room, playing the part of the overly chatty drunkard with ease. He slurred something about the show, about how close that blade had come and whether the banker would ever wear those shoes again. He leaned in, patted the man's shoulder like an old friend, and let his hand do what it did best. His fingers brushed the inside of the coat, finding the telltale smoothness of the crystal key and the faint arcane hum beneath its surface. But there was resistance. It wasn't just resting in the pocket. It was secured. A thin strap or thread held it fast, tied to the jacket itself, maybe even enchanted to alert its owner or trigger something worse. They weren't just careful. They were prepared. Or paranoid. Thomas paused for only a heartbeat, long enough to know the gamble wasn't worth it, and pulled back just as easily as he had leaned in. He laughed again, clinked his bottle against a half-full glass, and drifted away into a half-conversation with an invisible patron rambling about the joke concerning a juggler, 3 barren pianists, and a duck named Chuck. He hated coming up empty-handed, especially when the bait had been so close, but he didn't show it. He would get into the velvet suites. It was no longer a plan, he thought. It was a deadly serious mission. For now, he'd join the rest of the group, as they were slowly walking up to where the lady was sitting alone. They brought each other up to speed before engaging the blade juggler. They found her seated alone at a corner table, 3 empty cups in front of her like trophies from a battle fought not with blades, but with proof. Her posture was relaxed, almost too much so, and her eyes, though heavy-lidded and hazy from drink, carried a sharpness just beneath the glaze like a dagger hidden in silk. She didn't look up as they approached, not at first. Thomas stepped forward, his voice low and smooth, the tone casual but calculated, just the right rhythm of flattery, subtext, and implication that had served him in more than a few tight spots. He spoke not just of admiration for her performance, but of curiosity at the strange pageantry of this year's tournament. And perhaps most pointedly, he let slip that none among them held much affection for the patron bank behind it all. That, they all noticed, got her attention. She looked up at Celia first, who'd just bested her at the dancing duel, something steady behind the blur in her eyes, then let her gaze pass over the others, weighing them not as dancers or duelists, but as something more useful. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but resolute. She was in Tannertown because they were the leadership of Harken Bank. Everyone except the grand financier himself, which she noted with a sneer that twisted her lip like a scar. She made no mention of what she planned to do or how far she might go, but one thing was clear. Her quarrel with the bank was not professional. It was personal. She told them in clipped and bitter phrases about her parents, the most renowned actors in Inkwell, artists of such acclaim they had dreamed of founding the greatest theatre troupe the East had ever seen. But dreams cost coin, and coin came from Harken. And when the bank called in its loan early, without mercy or cause, they lost everything. The stage, the land, the legacy. Her parents died in ruin, their names forgotten by the courts that once applauded them. The last of the wealth she had melted down into the silver and jewelled daggers she had. She became the Lady of Inkwell not by choice but necessity. The name she wore like armour had once been a cage. She had been passed from gala to gala, costume to costume, made to dazzle, to grin, to slice apples mid-air with jewelled daggers while nobles laughed and clapped. A trophy in a travelling show that never ended. And now, just as she had reclaimed her life, The bank had emerged again. From shadows into spotlight. The drink had set in now, and her hand trembled as she poured another. Her voice faltered, but the fire in her eyes never dimmed. Thomas, with a flicker of empathy he rarely let show, thanked her for her honesty and told her, plainly, that they shared a common enemy. She waved them off, dismissive of sympathy but not of alliance. Her eyes closed as she drank again, her back straight, her sorrow hidden behind a final gulp. They left her in the noise and light of the ballroom, where revelry continued without pause. Celia lingered at the edge, watching a woman who had been made myth by force, not fame. Frizz, too, wore the expression of someone who had seen the fine print behind the poster. The party made their way back to the basement of the Velvet Fang, their fresh clothes and finery now catching lamplight like a joke that didn't need explaining. They too had danced in high halls and dined beside legends, only to return, much as they imagined the Lady of Inkwell would night after night, to scratchy straw beds and crates stacked like nightstands. A strange new ally had revealed herself despite the upcoming tourney. Perhaps they could count on some help when the time came to crack the secrets and vaults of the insidious Harken Bank. Sleep took them all one by one until soft morning bells woke the patrons. The next morning had arrived soft and golden, with the scent of roasted oats and sizzling sausage drifting through the air like a welcome banner. The adventurers walked the streets to the sound of bustling pop-up vendors and clinking dishes, and once again found generous portions of hearty food being passed to travellers with smiling efficiency. Everywhere they looked, something was being built, windmills rising like wooden giants, farmlands stretching wider by the day, and carts laden with tools and feed trundling through every street. Progress was visible, relentless, and carefully managed. Yet under that shine, the group couldn't shake the strange stillness they'd noticed before. They were weighing options. There was the local branch of Harken Bank, sure to be filled with answers, if not warmth. There were the towering guardian automatons, gleaming sentinels that raised too many questions and offered none in return, or perhaps the master chef whose dishes had delighted, but whose sudden presence in Tannertown still smelled faintly of mystery. While they ruminated near the town square, feet idly tracing the cobblestones and eyes flicking toward distant alleys, a frantic voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. Someone was calling for help. Few turned. Most ignored him outright, some even stepping away with expressions that bordered on discomfort. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something colder, social frostbite. The party, ever drawn to the odd and ignored, approached. The voice belonged to an old man, skin like cracked leather, eyes wide with desperation. He explained, between gulps of air and glances over his shoulder, that he lived alone on a small range just outside town, and had been tasked with bringing in his prized bison to help till the new ground. Not just any beast, but Bessie, a rare, fey-touched gloom bison, triple the size and strength of an ordinary ox. Celia raised an eyebrow and asked plainly if this meant he was trying to avoid hard labour in the fields. Thomas, cutting past politeness, went further and asked if this was about dodging the skinner's infamous pound of flesh. The old man's face twitched. He looked around, saw no friendly eyes, and gave a small, fearful nod. He whispered that if he couldn't bring Bessie in, he'd be taken instead, put to work to pay off what she was worth, a debt measured in sweat and years, and at his age, that was a death sentence drawn out over dry soil and broken hands. Frizz let out a quiet sigh, Celia's jaw tightened, and Zora gave the man a single solemn nod. Even Thomas's usual smirk faded, the memory of his own unwanted pact with Baba Yaga still lingering just beneath the surface. Zirath, standing slightly apart, folded his arms and grumbled under his breath. There was no coin in this, no glory, no contract to sign or prize to claim, just a missing beast and an old man's fading hope. Still, after a pause and a long look at the group around him, he nodded too. Last but not unwilling. Bessie, the fey-touched bison, had gone missing, and for some reason that meant it was now their problem. And so resigned, off he went into the Great Plains, in search of a magic cow. The old ranch hand's stead was little more than a sun-baked shack perched on the edge of nowhere, its boards warped by age and its roof patched with more hope than lumber. A tiny pen stood nearby, its gate swinging wide and idle in the breeze, the latch unbroken yet clearly unlatched, and the dust inside settled strangely, as if something large had once stood still for a very long time, then vanished in a hurry. The party fanned out, eyes scanning the parched soil and yellowed grass. It was meagre living, built on resilience and routine, but one detail stood out from the ordinary: the bison. Not just any beast, but Bessie, fey-touched and born of myth, a once-in-a-generation gift said to have wandered out of the vale and into the hands of this tired, sun-leathered man. She had been his miracle, his means of survival, and now she was gone. Zirath, ever the soldier, spotted it first. Just beneath the grass line, shallow and faint, were the impressions of hooves, not meandering but galloping, headed in a clean, desperate line toward the horizon. No other prints surrounded them, no boot marks, no wagon tracks, no sign of wolves or rustlers. Bessie had run. Hard. The old man had insisted she was loyal, gentle, and smarter than most ranch hands he'd ever known. Thomas, already suspicious, summoned his familiar, an owl with eyes keener than most maps, and sent it circling high above. If something had come from the sky, they would see it coming before it found them again. Thieving under the rule of Thaddeus Flint was unheard of, the old bent man had muttered back in town. No one dared it, with often the consequence being slightly too permanent for most. But he spoke of other things too, less logical ones, of shapes in the night and whispers in the soil. He claimed the interference of something ancient and hungry, though the sweat pooling at his collar and the wildness in his eyes suggested sunstroke more than prophecy. Still, the party had heard stranger things in quieter places. They followed the trail into the open plains, the landscape flattening into swaying grass and scattered rocks, where the wind carried no scent but dust and the buzz of unseen insects. Hours passed, until finally Thomas's owl let out a call and veered sharply. Perched between stones and half-covered shrubs stood Bessie, chewing on a mouthful of grass without a care in the world. She was glowing faintly in the light, her massive woolly frame pulsing with the natural shimmer of the Feywild, grazing calmly near a cluster of stone as if she hadn't given a single person a panic attack. Her eyes lifted as the party approached, unconcerned but watchful. Thomas stepped forward and, with a muttered incantation, cast Speak with Animals, his fingers glowing briefly as the magic took hold. What followed could only be described as unsettling. To the others, it was the strange, one-sided babble of a man losing a long argument with a very large cow. Thomas speaking in common, Bessie answering in low half-moos and snorts, while the warlock responded with nods and gasps like he was uncovering divine secrets from a hoofed oracle. Suddenly, Thomas's expression changed sharply, his back going rigid as he turned and relayed what she had told him. Bessie, she had told him, had been running from something. Something she could feel had followed them here. And then, without warning, the earth around them exploded. Dust and rock flew in every direction as soil erupted in pillars and trenches, and the calm silence of the plains was replaced by the deafening howl of something old, buried, and very awake. From the churned soil rose two hulking monstrosities, bullets, land sharks of nightmare and muscle, their armoured hides rippling with buried rage as they burst forth in tandem. Their maws gaped with rows of jagged teeth, and their claws dug deep trenches as they reared up, jaws snapping, eyes wild and rolling. The first bullet landed hard, slamming into the earth with enough force to shake the ground beneath their boots. The second twisted mid-air and came down directly between Thomas and Celia, scattering the party like leaves before a storm. Zora didn't hesitate. With a guttural roar he charged, his newly gifted wild magic surging like wildfire through his veins. His great sword shimmered with chaotic energy as he swung it in a wide arc, the blade singing as it bit deep into the boulette's plated shoulder. A ripple of unstable arcane power surged from the strike. Wild energy exploded outward in a flash of vibrant light, briefly causing Zora's form to blur with mirror-like reflections before snapping back into focus. The bullet shrieked and staggered, but retaliated immediately with a brutal slam of its claw. Thomas, already mid-incantation, took the full brunt of the blow and was launched backward, crashing into a stone with a crack that echoed across the plain. His body crumpled, unmoving, the celestial light around him flickering out. Celia ducked beneath the second bullet, gaping more, and struck with a flurry of blows, her fists and feet hammering into its flanks with precision, honed through years of monk training. She flipped over its snapping head, spun in mid-air, and delivered a savage kick to the joint behind its leg, but the creature bucked violently, twisting in a sudden burst of muscle. It caught her mid-air and slammed her into the rock face, and she fell hard to the ground, motionless beside Thomas. Frizz's eyes went wide, then narrowed. She raised her hands, firelight blooming at her fingertips, and with a snarl of wrath and grief, she unleashed Fireball. The spell spun once in her palm before she launched it into the heart of the chaos. The explosion bloomed like a rising star, a burst of flame and force that swallowed both bullets in a towering inferno. The heatwave rolled outward, scorching grass, blackening stone, and drawing screams of agony from the creatures as their thick hides blistered and smoked. Zirath surged forward like a storm given shape. He gripped his massive great axe in both hands, calling upon the divine power of his oath, and his blade lit with holy radiance as he brought it crashing down. With a roar of vengeance, he channeled his fury into a devastating divine smite, the radiant energy exploding on impact, splitting a plate of the bullet's armoured back and flooding it with light. The force sent tremors through the beast's limbs, and it howled in fury and pain as the paladin pressed forward. The creatures, burned and bleeding, circled now, wounded but far from broken. Zora, eyes blazing with raw magic, raised his greatsword again and launched into a whirlwind of strikes. Each swing sparked with chaotic magic, ghostly echoes flickering in his wake, bursts of wind and flickers of flame trailing each slash, until with a final bellow he drove the blade deep into the second bullet's flank, the impact ringing like a war drum across the plains. Friz, hands still smoking, prepared her next spell, standing tall beside Zirath, who now guarded the unconscious forms of Thomas and Celia, his great axe glowing faintly with lingering divine wrath. The battlefield was chaos, heat still shimmering in the air where Frizz's fireball had scorched the earth to glass, and dust swirling around the massive frames of the injured bullets. Celia ran to Thomas and cast Spare the Dying to stabilize him. Thomas, groaning back to life, stirred from where he lay crumpled near the stone, his hand twitching as radiant magic flickered back to life around his fingers. She ran to him and gave him a potion. He coughed once, muttered something about his spine being in a different shape than he remembered, and then, with blood on his lip and fire in his eyes, lifted a shaking hand and unleashed Eldritch Blast. Twin lances of crackling celestial force erupted from his palm, arcing through the air with unnatural precision. The first blast struck one of the bullets directly in the eye, and it shrieked as the energy tore into the sensitive flesh. The second followed a heartbeat later, slamming into the already fractured plating on its flank with a concussive crack. The force lifted the creature slightly, its limbs thrashing, but only for a moment. Then it collapsed, the weight of its enormous body folding in on itself, limbs twitching once before it lay still. The other bullet reared back, its eyes darting between the scattered bodies, the scent of blood thick in its nostrils. Defying its sheer size, it ran and leapt at Thomas and Celia once more, the concussive force of the impact again knocking them unconscious. Friz, smoke still curling from her sleeves, raised her hand again and snapped her fingers. A firebolt shot like a streak of vengeance from her palm, striking the creature across its scarred hide, and igniting a fresh burst of flame that sent it staggering sideways, its plating glowing red-hot. Zirath charged without a word, his great axe still pulsing with divine heat, and brought it down in a sweeping arc that carved deep into the bullet's side. Radiant energy erupted from the blade as he called upon his divine power once more, the light searing through flesh and bone with holy fury. Zora was already there, wild-eyed, covered in dust and ash, his great sword crackling faintly with residual magic. He spun past Zirath with a grunt, and with a final reckless roar, brought his blade down in a brutal overhead strike. The great sword split through the bullet's shoulder and into its chest, and the creature finally buckled under the weight of steel and spell. It let out one last breath, more a rumble than a cry, and collapsed beside its fallen kin, the ground quaking beneath the impact. Silence followed, save for the sound of Zora's heavy breathing, and Thomas muttering something about how getting trampled by a land shark really ruins a mood. Frizz was already checking Celia, who stirred, bruised but alive. The dust settled, and the great plains, scarred and scorched, were quiet once more. The return journey with Bessie should have been peaceful, if not outright triumphant. The great fey-touched bison lumbered along without complaint, her hooves thudding softly against the packed earth as the party led her across the plains. The sky above was a soft gold, the wind cool, and the weight of their earlier battle with the boulettes still clung to their muscles, but spirits were cautiously high. Then the clouds rolled in. They came quickly, unnaturally so, swallowing the sun in a sweep of steel-grey shadow that turned the fields dim and cold. The temperature dropped in seconds, and the wind shifted. Frizz looked up, her instincts already twitching. Then came the thunder, low at first, almost distant, until Zora muttered that it wasn't thunder. It was hooves. From the ridge to the west they appeared like ghosts conjured from storm and dust, 4 hobgoblin warlords, clad in dark iron and riding snarling direwolves, their fur black as soot and eyes burning red in the gathering gloom. The warlords wore war paint and wielded longbows already drawn, each arrow notched with practiced calm, their blades gleaming at their hips as they fanned out to encircle the party. The attack began in a flurry. Arrows hissed through the air like angry insects, one striking Thomas square in the shoulder, another grazing Celia's arm. The warlords didn't charge immediately. They moved, fast and precise, their direwolves leaping over low rocks and ducking behind scrub to strike from flanks. It wasn't just a raid. It was a hunt. Zirath was the first to meet them head-on, swinging his great axe with radiant fury as one warlord closed the distance. He parried a blow with his gauntlet and retaliated with a devastating divine smite that sent a wave of holy light through the wolf's flank. But the warlord didn't fall. He screamed in rage, and the direwolf lunged again, biting into Zirath's thigh and pulling him off balance. Zora met another rider mid-charge, his greatsword cleaving through the wolf's armoured shoulder with a wild magic surge that sent a pulse of force across the field. The blast knocked the rider back, but not down. The hobgoblin flipped mid-air, landed in a roll and came up firing, the arrow grazing Zora's ribs before he could reset his stance. Celia darted between wolves and riders, fists and feet flashing in blurs of motion, each strike precise, each movement calculated, but the sheer speed of the wolves made it impossible to avoid every blow. She took a slash to her side, another across her shoulder, and barely had time to breathe before ducking another arrow. Thomas, bleeding and barely upright, took cover behind a boulder while launching eldritch blasts toward a flanking rider. The blasts struck home, crackling with divine power, but the rider still advanced, bloodied but relentless. Frizz stood in the centre, robes torn, one arm scorched from a near miss. She hurled a firebolt, catching one of the wolves in the face and sending it tumbling, but it wasn't enough to stop them. The warlords fought with ruthless discipline, never faltering, always pressing, cutting off escapes, coordinating strikes. They weren't raiders. They were soldiers. The battle turned bloody fast. Thomas was knocked back again, nearly unconscious, his last healing light spent. Celia dragged him behind cover and shielded him with her own body as another volley rained down. Zirath fought like a cornered beast, smiting and parrying, taking wounds in kind. Zora roared through a storm of steel and fur, his sword dancing like lightning, but even he was starting to slow. And overhead thunder cracked louder. The final warlord, bloodied but laughing, raised his sword and bellowed a command in Goblin, and the wolves responded with howls as they circled in for the kill. Frizz narrowed her eyes. With her last reservoir of strength, she stepped forward, cloak billowing in the wind, and raised her hand as stormlight flared in her palm. The goblin's blade glinted mid-swing so very near, charging at Frizz, and then vanished. With a thunderous crack she cast banishment, her voice rising over the wind, the air around her humming with arcane weight. The warlord's form shimmered, distorted, and in a flash of violet light he was gone, cast into a plainer void with nothing but a faint pop of displaced air. The direwolf he rode let out a confused whimper, then bolted. Silence fell. Only the distant rumble of thunder remained as the survivors caught their breath. Thomas sat up slowly. Celia slumped beside him. Zora dropped to one knee, blood dripping from his blade. Zirath stood tall, though his armour bore new dents and fresh blood. Frizz didn't speak. She simply lowered her arm, wiped a smear of soot from her cheek, and turned back toward Bessie, who had not moved a hoof through the entire encounter. Luck, it would seem, protected fools, children, and Feywild bison named Bessie. Together, bruised and bloodied, they turned back toward the ranch. It would be a long walk, though Bessie was safe. Something was wrong. The thunder rolled again, louder now, sharper, and still the sky refused to weep. No rain fell, no clouds wept, just that rising wind and the deafening whip-crack burst of sound that made the air vibrate in their chests. Bessie, usually calm and plodding, began to shimmer. Her fur glowed with increasing brilliance, her hooves stamping anxiously as her fey-touched magic stirred. She felt it too. Then the sun was gone. Frizz was yelling something over the thunder to everyone, but her voice was lost to the chaos. The others only caught a few words. No rain, beastlands, thunder. Another thunderclap shook the ground. The wind howled like wolves made of wind and sorrow, and the sky turned to pitch without warning. Shadows lengthened, flickering unnaturally, until a single white flash split the heavens. And in that instant, the world shifted. They were no longer on the plains or anywhere near them. The grass, the dirt, the familiar forms of brush and stone, gone. They now stood in a twisted, shifting half-world caught between the grasslands of the material plane and the Feywild. The ground cracked open, splitting beneath their feet, and rivers of dark red flowing blood ran through the fissures. From the clouds high above, landing with an earth-shattering impact, the Phantom arrived, a towering minotaur, cloaked in smoke and flame, his eyes twin infernos that glared through the gloom with the heat of judgment. His horns were forged of black steel curling like blades, and each hoofstep struck the ground with the clang of hammer on anvil. He snorted, and fire escaped his nostrils. His breath was hot, so hot they felt it on their skin, drying their mouths and cracking their lips in an instant. A bolt of cold, visceral fear shot through the party, primal and deep. Before them was a force of nature, the guardian of the plains, both shepherd and predator, the dark judge between worlds, and he had found them. We end our tale today with the party in the presence of the dark spirit of the plains, the Phantom, thunder whip in hand, and judgment in his eyes. Until next time, fellow adventurers.